Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Happy Monday. Glad you're back with us as we continue through the Gospel of John. Find ourselves in the 11th chapter. Really interesting chapter, primarily centered on the story of Lazarus and the experience. If you weren't with us last Thursday, might be worth trying to go back and pick that up at some point, because the introduction to the story does provide some context and sets the stage. We are in the 17th verse, and I'll read down through probably about verse 27, and then we'll come back and have some discussion. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him, while Mary stayed home. Martha said to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would have not died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." So, to begin with, John sets the context here. Jesus arrives. Lazarus has been entombed 4 days, and that does a couple things in the flow of the story. It solidifies the fact that Lazarus is dead, body has been prepared, he's been buried or entombed, and he also then tells us that there's a crowd of people there because of the proximity with Jerusalem. Martha and Mary, who seem to be well thought of by many, are visited, and there is grieving. I don't know all of the details, Michael, but I know that in the world of Jesus, in the Jewish world of Jesus, funerals were often extended over a couple days. There is a period of mourning, a set period of grieving. There are meals, there are people coming and going. This would be a little bit different than probably our experience of a funeral. And so I think one of the things that helps to know is that there's a lot happening here. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of coming and going, and Jesus joins this crowd after they're well down that road.
Yeah, there's a lot of actual cultural elements here that I think are really important to get our minds around, Clint. I think that certainly the first is this idea of sort of almost the professional griever, that you would have this group that would come in and maybe even be more animated in the expression of grief, that was not an uncommon reality in as part of this longer elongated funeral process. So you've got some of that cultural element type things as well. Also want to just point out that there's also significance not just in the fact that by day 4 a person is really, really dead, right? There's no questions about whether maybe the person was sick or all of that's gone. But commentators also make note of the fact that there's some belief that the soul may stick around in the Judeo context, so that there's this idea that on the fourth day, death is death. It's over. It's the end. In other words, maybe as a shorthand, Clint, to say when Jesus comes back, when Jesus enters into the story with Lazarus 4 days in, that at this point is a story of Jesus encountering a dead man. And so that throws into amazing contrast the teaching that Jesus has already given to us to this point in the text, this idea that those who believe in me never die. Very clearly, John sets this story up so that an original reader in the first context would understand that what we're talking about is a very clearly a clear-cut case dead man. Jesus is now talking about life forever, and these two things are intended to be contrasting elements. They're supposed to stick out to us in the story.
There's another detail, and you have to kind of know a little bit more of the backstory, but if we're familiar with the Mary and Martha stories in the broader context of the gospel, remember that it's Martha who stays busy while Mary sits at Jesus' feet. Here, we have a kind of reversal of that. Martha comes out, the older sister, to meet Jesus, while Mary stays at home. And this text gives you a couple of places where you get to make some decisions about things. And Mary and Martha are going to represent one of those decisions. And Martha's words here in this verse 21 give us another point where we have to kind of make a decision. There's a little bit of interpretation that happens here. Martha says to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." Now, there's a couple of ways to hear that. One can hear that as an affirmation of faith. Lord, if you'd been here, I know you could have done something. I know you could have changed the reality of what happened. I know this could have been avoided. I believe that you could have done something. The other one is to hear it with a hint of accusation, particularly because Jesus told the disciples he was going to take his time, right? And so we don't know that Martha knows that, other than to say maybe she knows where Jesus was. It's not clear what she does or doesn't know, but you can hear in her words, why weren't you here? If you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. You could have stopped it. You could have changed it. Now, I don't know if it's a clear situation that John wants us to pick one of those over the other. Maybe he writes it up this way so that we get to hold both of those things in tension. It is both the pain of the absence of Jesus and an affirmation that Jesus could have made a difference. But it's an interesting moment where Mary doesn't even come out to see Jesus, and Martha says words that might be interpreted to be a little bit salty.
I want to dig into that just a little bit more, Clint, before we move on. And the point I want to make very simply is we don't know what John wants us to do in terms of that interpretive move, but I think we can say something with 100% confidence. We do know what John has told us, the reader, up to this point. And make no mistake about it, John has included on purpose, this is not accidental in the book, as carefully written as John has included when Jesus told the disciples, we're going to wait a little bit. We're going to give this some time. So John knows that the reader is aware of that. And John is presenting to us characters. I mean, Martha is clearly grieving. This is clearly caught up in the midst of a funeral. And only 4 days into the process of this extended family ritual is Jesus and the disciples arriving, right? These are important people. And so we as the reader, regardless of what John wants us to choose about what Martha's feeling, we do feel the tension of that moment. We do wonder, why is the Messiah, the teacher, the rabbi, all of these things at the same time? Why is Jesus not the first one there comforting this family in the midst of their grief? And of course, that creates tension within us. And it's out of that sort of seedbed of tension that if you linger there and you go with John, there's going to be an unbelievable revelation, which will then lead to teaching, which will then lead to greater understanding of who Jesus Christ is, which is the purpose of this book. But it's just needless to say, Clint, that you're exactly right. I do think there's this interpretive gap space in the text, but what we know with confidence is that John isn't going to tie up all those loose ends at this point in the story because John wants us hooked on what's happening here, and John's succeeding.
Yeah. And, and again, Martha does say here, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. But then later she says, I know he'll raise in the last day. There is some looseness here, and I think John gives us some chance to navigate that. So Jesus responds, your brother will rise again. And Martha, again, she takes that as good news. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Now, this is an interesting moment because there is already within Judaism this kind of thing, or within, at least in Martha's mind, there's this idea of the final resurrection. But then that statement occasions Jesus' fifth I am, if you're keeping track of the I am statements, there's 7 total. This brings us to number 5. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And then he gives these words that I think are well known in the Gospel of John. To believe in me, even though they will die, they will live, and everyone who lives, believes in me will never die. And he asks Martha, do you believe this? So Jesus has claimed something important for himself. I am the resurrection. I am the power of life and death. I am the one who calls back from the dead the living. I am the one who gives life, either a life that avoids death. And again, keep in mind, John generally means spiritual terms. When we're using these words, he has in mind, yes, physical life and death, which is the backdrop of this story, but for John, that's always a mirror of spiritual life and death, which in the gospel is, I think you could make a case more important. So Jesus says this, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? And we've said it, I don't know how many times, Michael, and not to beat it into the ground here, but this is the question of John. I am this thing. I am this one. I am this power. I am. Do you believe this? And here we have that question not only set before the reader, but literally set before one of the characters.
So, Clint, this isn't surprising to you, but if you've been with us along for this study, that doesn't mean that you've been following along with some of the comments on our other videos. And I'll tell you, some of the more common themes of comments we get as people go on this study, Clint, is they come to statements like this, where Jesus says things like this: I'm the resurrection, the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. That the most common things that we even get today in comments is, that's ridiculous. That makes no sense. A very literal reading of what Jesus has to say. You can't die and live at the same time, you stupid people. How do you believe that? I understand that. I understand how people get there. And to be honest with you, that's a little bit of the trap that John has laid in this narrative, because, and this is the genius of it, it's the exact thing that Jesus is doing to that original audience, the Jews who Martha, I don't think, maybe you disagree with this, I don't think John gives us any reason to doubt the veracity or the will of Martha in these statements. They are statements of faith. But when compared to the brightness of the revelation of the light, the life of the world, they pale in comparison. And I think to make that point, I would only point out how she responds in verse 27 when he asks, do you believe? What she can come to say is, I believe that you're the Messiah, even the Son of God, which is a substantial statement, coming into the world, but not quite the full step to resurrection and the life, the one who will never die, the one who is the fount of all hope and life. And then go back through all these I am statements. What Jesus is claiming is beyond what the characters in this story can comprehend, because from a very simple, literalistic, deterministic viewpoint, it makes no sense. From the lens of faith, looking at Christ and seeing how that retranslates the entire experience of the world, then suddenly things begin to shift into gear and into clarity. And I think, Clint, that of course, questions to characters in this book are questions that come to us. And I think that each one of us should find some comfort in that, to be honest with you, because we're not going to always go through seasons of life where faith feels like it goes all the way down. So sometimes those faith statements that we make are really holding on as strong as we can, and the truth is that's rather weakly. And I think there's some comfort that even the people who meet Jesus in their greatest moments, the in flesh, walking, standing, hugging, holding them, Jesus, those characters struggle to hold on to him as well. And so there's some hope and comfort that comes to later disciples from a text like this.
I want to say something, and then I want to kind of put an asterisk on it, because it will come up again on one of the very last days of this study, when at some point we get to the end of the book of John. In the Gospel of John, belief isn't simply a mental process of putting facts together and understanding something. It's revealed to you. It's seen. And so Martha expresses a level of faith here that is what she's able to process, but there's more coming. And so these stories that John tells, the picture of Jesus doing miracles and, calling as he's going to do Lazarus back to life, this reveals to people when they see who Jesus is and what Jesus does, it responds in the choice to believe and a deeper understanding. This is a tremendous affirmation. Again, if you think about the other Gospels, this is Peter's confession. In the other Gospels, we make a mountaintop out of Peter standing and Jesus says, well, what do you say about me? And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Peter gets somewhat famous that's a big deal. This is no less than that.
Yeah.
Martha voices a proclamation that Jesus is the Messiah. She just doesn't yet understand the fullness of what that means. Now she's about to, but she hasn't gotten there yet. And John is just wonderfully helping us journey along with her as she discovers, okay, I profess this thing, but I don't yet understand the fullness of what it means. I think I say this a lot, and I'm sorry, but it's really, really well done.
You've also uncovered there, and I don't want this to pass by without pointing it out. Luke gets a lot of credit. In fact, we did a whole study of Luke, and so if you want a big dose of this, go watch, listen, follow through that. But Clint, Luke gets a lot of mentions about the gospel for the least, the gospel for the outcast, but that happens in John. Right? Jesus goes and spends substantial time in the Samaritan community. He reveals himself to the blind man, and there's multiple chapters dedicated to the conflict that flows out of that. Here, Jesus is receiving one of the great statements of faith from a woman, which in the original first century culture would have been a very tenuous witness in a court of law legally. So the idea that John is lifting this up as she is seeing, she's responding to revelation. I do think that, to John's credit, John is not interested in the bona fides of the people who are the witnesses. It is literally anyone, regardless of your rank or station, who sees the revelation of Christ at work. If you see it, you are a qualified witness to what God is doing in the world. And that's an amazing kind of flavor that gets worked into this gospel. I think, you lift that out. I think that's 100% fair.
I might even go so far as to say, Michael, that with a couple significant exceptions, Nicodemus and arguably one other one in the later part of Mark, the further you are up the ladder, the less chance you have of seeing who Jesus is.
Yeah.
There is a kind of reversal. That's not just John. That's kind of inherent in all of the Gospels, but certainly we see it in John.
All right, so here's the thing, tough truth. I know we didn't get far today, but there's a lot in this text. It's a deep text, it's a deep story, and it has a lot of resonance. So we're glad that for the time that you spent with us, if it's been encouraging to you, if it's been challenging to you, if you've learned something in it, give this video a like. It will help others find it in their own studies of John. But do subscribe, or at least come back tomorrow, or click on the next video, or whatever that is for you, because this story is only going to get better. It's only go deeper. We're only going to learn more. So we certainly hope that you will join us as we continue on.
Thank you for your time.